On a quiet street in Charlotte, North Carolina, neighbors often spoke of Rachel and Mark Whitman as the kind of couple people aspired to be. A two-story brick home, backyard gatherings, Sunday services at the church Rachel's family had attended for decades. It looked like stability carved in stone. But as investigators would later learn, this perfect image concealed fractures that no one saw coming. Rachel was 32, a nurse whose long hours were worn proudly as a badge of sacrifice. Mark, in his mid-30s, worked in real estate, always smiling at community events, the man who never missed shaking a hand. Together, they looked untouchable. Yet, behind their locked door, silence lingered longer than it should have, and moments of connection were replaced with routine. Friends saw only the polished version, Rachel's warm laughter, Mark's steady charm. What they couldn't see were Rachel's late-night walks to clear her mind, or the way Mark lingered on the porch alone, staring into the dark as though searching for something he couldn't name. Why would a marriage that seemed so solid begin to crack? And how did those cracks widen into a scandal that would leave their community whispering for years? For Rachel, the answer began with a single decision, inviting her mother into their home. A decision meant to bring comfort, but one that would ultimately unravel everything she believed about love, loyalty, and family. Diane Whitman, Rachel's mother, had always been a presence in her daughter's life, proud, opinionated, and fiercely protective. When she required hip surgery, Rachel didn't hesitate to offer a place in her home for recovery. It was supposed to be temporary, a few weeks, maybe a month. Instead, it became the seed of a conflict that would grow in silence. At first, Mark played the role of dutiful son-in-law. He carried groceries, fetched blankets, and lingered by Diane's side as she struggled through physical therapy exercises. Neighbors saw kindness. Rachel saw patience. Yet, over time, those small gestures stretched into longer conversations, private smiles, and an ease between Mark and Diane that Rachel didn't quite understand. Her long shifts at Atrium Health meant hours away from home. She told herself she was grateful Diane had company. Still, when she returned, she sometimes noticed the faint sound of laughter dying down as she entered, or the wine glasses left on the counter, their rims marked with traces of a shared evening. Rachel dismissed these details until much later, when she replayed them in her mind with chilling clarity. Could the boundaries of family have blurred without her even realizing? Could what began as care and gratitude have crossed into something far more dangerous? The thought never left her, and as Diane's stay stretched from weeks into months, Rachel's home, once a symbol of pride, began to feel like a stage where unspoken tensions were quietly building toward a breaking point. Rachel's career as a nurse demanded sacrifices. 12-hour shifts, double rotations, and nights spent under the harsh glow of hospital lights left her too drained to notice what was shifting back home. She told herself she was providing, that her absence was temporary. What she didn't realize was that her long hours created space. Space where something unthinkable began to take root. Mark often arrived home before her, sometimes with dinner prepared for Diane, sometimes with a bottle of wine already opened. Their conversation slipped into areas usually reserved for spouses, hopes, regrets, memories. Diane confided in him about the loneliness of aging, how she felt invisible since her surgery. Mark admitted he felt overlooked, too, living in Rachel's shadow of tireless work. What started as shared empathy soon turned into long evenings on the couch, whispers that grew softer when Rachel walked in, and silences that carried more weight than words. Rachel noticed the warmth in their exchanges, but she brushed it aside. After all, what harm could come from kindness? Yet, in those quiet hours when Rachel was gone, lines blurred. Mark and Diane were no longer just a husband and a mother-in-law sharing a house. They were becoming something else entirely. The unanswered question lingered. If Rachel had been home more often, could this have been prevented? Or was this collision inevitable, set in motion long before Diane moved in? And soon, one night in particular would leave Rachel unable to ignore the truth. Thanksgiving was supposed to be a night of gratitude. Rachel finished a late shift and hurried home, imagining the smell of roasted turkey still hanging in the air. The family she loved gathered in warmth. Instead, what she found stopped her at the doorway. The kitchen lights were dim, but the glow revealed Mark and Diane sitting close together, a half-empty bottle of wine between them. Their laughter echoed through the house, intimate and unguarded. It wasn't the laughter of in-laws. It was the laughter of confidants, of two people who shared more than they should. Rachel froze. For a moment, she convinced herself she was imagining things, that it was nothing more than harmless cheer after a long holiday. But when Mark noticed her standing there, his smile faltered, and Diane quickly lowered her eyes. That fleeting reaction told Rachel more than words ever could. She joined them at the table, forcing a smile, but her chest tightened with unease. Every glance exchanged between Mark and Diane felt heavy, coded. Every shared joke cut sharper than it should. Was she losing her husband to her own mother? The thought was so outrageous, so grotesque, she forced herself to dismiss it. Families stick together, she reminded herself. Families forgive odd moments. Yet deep inside, a seed of suspicion was planted that night, and in the weeks to come, it would grow into something she could no longer silence. The weeks after Thanksgiving were heavy, with tension Rachel couldn't quite name. She buried herself in work, but when she returned home, she noticed how quickly conversations stopped when she entered a room. Laughter died in an instant. Even the air felt charged with something she couldn't put her finger on. Then, one night, unable to sleep, Rachel walked past her mother's room and froze. Diane's voice was hushed, trembling as she spoke into the phone. Rachel leaned closer, holding her breath. "He promised me it wouldn't go this far," Diane whispered. Rachel's blood ran cold. Who was she talking about? What had gone too far? She wanted to burst into the room, demand answers, but fear rooted her to the spot. If her suspicion was true, if Mark was involved, then hearing it confirmed might destroy her. She crept back to her room, her heart hammering. For days, the words replayed in her mind like a haunting refrain. Was Diane speaking of a secret lover from her past? Was it possible her mother had found someone new, someone who wasn't Mark? Rachel clung to that explanation, because the alternative was too horrifying to consider. Still, the unease settled deeper. She began watching them more closely, noting every glance, every pause in conversation when she walked in. Rachel didn't know it yet, but she was standing on the edge of a discovery that would shatter not only her marriage, but her entire sense of family. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that her world was shifting beneath her feet. Each time she came home, she caught fragments of warmth between Mark and Diane that didn't belong. The casual touch of a hand on a shoulder, a lingering gaze, a shared smile that spoke volumes in silence. When she confronted Mark casually, "You and Mom seem close lately," he brushed it off with a laugh. "She's family, Rachel. What else would you expect?" But Rachel noticed the defensiveness in his tone, the way his eyes flickered away. And when she asked Diane, her mother gave the same answer, but with a nervous edge, as if rehearsed. The once stable marriage that Rachel thought she could count on now felt fragile. Nights in bed were marked by distance. Mark rolled away from her, claiming exhaustion. Rachel, wide awake, stared at the ceiling, her mind circling questions she couldn't answer. Why was her husband confiding in her mother more than in her? Why was her mother, her trusted anchor, suddenly a stranger? Her instincts told her something was wrong, yet she had no proof, no tangible evidence, just fragments of unease building into a storm. She began keeping mental notes of everything: the empty wine bottles, the sudden hush when she entered a room, the way Diane's cheeks flushed when Mark walked by. Rachel's trust was splintering piece by piece, and though she didn't know it yet, the moment of truth was closing in. A revelation was coming, one she would never be able to forget. December crept into Charlotte with cold nights and frosted mornings, but inside Rachel's home, the air was heavier than the winter chill. The tension had become routine. Silences stretched, laughter was rare, and suspicion followed Rachel like a shadow. She thought she was prepared for anything, but nothing could prepare her for what Diane revealed. It was a Sunday afternoon. Rachel had just returned from church, while Mark and Diane stayed home. They sat in the living room when Diane, with her hands trembling, finally spoke. "I need to tell you both something," she began. Her voice quivered, but her eyes held steady. "I'm pregnant." The word struck Rachel like a physical blow. For a moment, the room seemed to spin. Pregnant, At 54, her mind raced, clinging to any explanation. Maybe a miracle, maybe a doctor's mistake, maybe some long-lost flame Diane had reconnected with. Rachel forced out the question. Who's the father? Diane's silence was deafening. Mark stared at the floor, his jaw clenched tight, saying nothing. Rachel's pulse thundered in her ears. Surely it wasn't Mark. Surely the man she had trusted with her vows, the man her community respected, couldn't possibly. But that silence told its own story, a silence that made Rachel's stomach twist with dread. Still, she clung to denial. She needed proof. She needed answers, and she would stop at nothing to get them. Rachel's desperation turned into determination. She demanded clarity, refusing to live in the fog of suspicion. Diane resisted at first. Mark grew defensive, but Rachel wouldn't bend. The truth had to be undeniable, written in black and white. The test was arranged quietly, with Rachel holding her breath through every step. The waiting days were torture. Every glance between Mark and Diane gnawed at her. Every night alone in bed, she asked herself the same haunting question. What if the truth destroys everything? Finally, the envelope arrived. Rachel's hands shook as she tore it open. Each word blurred through her tears, but the conclusion was clear, unshakable, scientific, undeniable. The father of Diane's unborn child was Mark. Rachel dropped the paper, her legs buckling beneath her. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a collapse of the very structure of her life. Her husband hadn't simply broken his vows. He had shattered the sacred boundary between mother and daughter. She confronted them, her voice breaking as she demanded an explanation. Diane sobbed, Mark stood frozen, and Rachel felt as though she were watching strangers in her own home. Her marriage, her family, her sense of self, all of it lay in ruins with that single piece of paper. But the worst revelation was still to come, because when Mark finally chose to speak, his confession cut even deeper than the test results. Rachel thought the DNA results were the end of the nightmare. The truth was exposed, the betrayal undeniable. But Mark's silence after the reveal gnawed at her, because silence often hides something worse. When he finally spoke, his words twisted the knife. Mark admitted it wasn't a careless mistake, not a one-time lapse brought on by proximity. It wasn't an accident, he said flatly. Diane understands me in ways you never have. Rachel's stomach turned. This wasn't regret. This was devotion. He spoke as if Diane wasn't her mother, but his partner, as if their connection wasn't a betrayal, but destiny. And then came the revelation that broke her completely. Their bond had started long before the pregnancy, even before Rachel and Mark's wedding day. He confessed that what Rachel believed was her love story had been tainted from the beginning. Every milestone, the proposal, the vows, the home they built, was built on a lie. Rachel's voice shook as she demanded answers. Why her mother? Why this betrayal? Mark's eyes were cold, almost resolute. It was always going to be her, he whispered. Rachel's entire world tilted. This wasn't just infidelity. It was a betrayal that rewrote her past, her present, and her future in one cruel sweep. And with the baby still growing inside Diane, there was no erasing what had been done. In the days that followed, the Whitman house became a prison of silence. Rachel couldn't bear to look at Mark, yet she couldn't escape the sound of his footsteps in the halls they once shared. Diane moved carefully through the house, her presence a constant reminder of the betrayal growing inside her. The community began to notice. At church, whispers followed Rachel down the aisle. At work, sympathetic glances carried weight she didn't ask for. She avoided the eyes of neighbors, knowing they were already piecing together rumors about her husband and her mother. Meals were no longer shared. The once lively kitchen now sat cold and unused. Nights were spent in separate rooms, Rachel lying awake with memories of her wedding day crashing against the truth of her marriage. She wanted to scream. She wanted to demand why the two people she trusted most had carved such a wound into her life. But when she opened her mouth, words refused to come. Instead, Rachel endured the suffocating quiet, the home that now felt foreign. She wondered if she should leave, start fresh. But where does one go when the betrayal follows everywhere, when the whispers of neighbors feel louder than her own thoughts? The marriage wasn't just broken, it was collapsing into rubble around her. and Rachel was left to crawl through the wreckage alone. And yet, the cruelest part was still ahead, because soon, everyone in Charlotte would know. Charlotte had always felt like home to Rachel, but now the streets she grew up on turned hostile. The news spread quietly at first, whispered between pews at Sunday service, murmured at grocery stores, traded like forbidden gossip at backyard fences. By January, Rachel could no longer ignore it. The whole community knew. Friends who once embraced her now avoided her eyes. Neighbors who used to wave from their porches crossed their arms instead. Even her workplace, a place she once found purpose, felt colder. Patients' families whispered when they recognized her name. She heard fragments of conversation. Her husband? With her mother? Followed by stifled laughter or pitying sighs. Each word chipped away at her dignity. The church pews, once her sanctuary, now felt like a courtroom. Every hymn rang hollow when she sensed the stares boring into her back. Rachel's shame grew heavier, but so did her anger. How had her husband and mother dragged her into this humiliation? How had their betrayal become her burden to carry? Late at night, she sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the empty chair across from her, remembering the days when her life had been simple, respected, untarnished. Now, the whispers followed her like shadows, and though the community didn't say it aloud, Rachel knew what they were all asking. Would she raise the child? Would she stay or walk away? That question haunted her as she prepared for a confrontation she could no longer avoid. The confrontation came one cold evening when Rachel found Diane sitting in the living room, hands folded protectively over her stomach. For weeks, Rachel had bottled up her fury, her heartbreak, her humiliation. But this time, she couldn't stay silent. How could you? Rachel's voice cracked, but her eyes burned with fire. You're my mother, my own mother, and you took the one person I trusted most. Diane's face crumpled. She whispered apologies through tears, but they sounded hollow, rehearsed. She tried to explain the loneliness, the vulnerability after her surgery, the way Mark had listened when no one else did. But Rachel heard none of it as justification. Each word only deepened the wound. You had me. Rachel shot back. You had a daughter who would have done anything for you, and you still chose him. Diane sobbed openly now, claiming she never meant for it to happen, that the bond with Mark had caught her off guard. But to Rachel, it felt like betrayal by design. The distance between mother and daughter stretched wider than ever before. For Rachel, the woman who raised her now felt like a stranger. For Diane, the daughter she loved had turned into an accuser she couldn't reach. The room fell silent, but the silence spoke louder than words. Their family was fractured, and nothing would ever mend it back to the way it once was. And as Rachel turned away, one thought echoed in her mind. If her own mother could betray her, who could she ever trust again? Rachel's confrontation with Diane left her shaken, but Mark's response cut deeper still. One night, he cornered her in the kitchen, his voice low, almost calm, as if he were offering a reasonable solution. This doesn't have to tear us apart, he said. We can make this work. You, me, and your mother. We can raise the baby together. Rachel's heart nearly stopped. The words sounded monstrous, a perverse rewriting of family. She stared at him, unable to believe the man she married could even suggest such a thing. You think I would raise my husband's child, my mother's child, as my own? She spat, her voice trembling with fury. Mark's face hardened. This is bigger than you, Rachel. Diane and I were connected in ways you'll never understand. It was a declaration, not a plea. And in that moment, Rachel realized her marriage was not salvageable. She was no longer fighting for her relationship. She was fighting for her sanity. The walls of her home felt suffocating, every room carrying the weight of betrayal. Mark's steady confidence terrified her. He no longer seemed like a husband caught in a mistake, but a man convinced of his new reality. Rachel stood at a crossroads. Fight to stay and risk losing herself entirely, or walk away from both her husband and her mother forever. But before she could decide, life forced her hand, because the child at the center of it all was about to arrive. The hospital room was thick with tension when Diane went into labor. Rachel stood outside the door, torn between two unbearable truths. Inside, her mother was giving birth. Inside, her husband was becoming a father again. and the child would carry both their blood. She could hear Diane's cries through the walls, the muffled encouragement of doctors, the hum of machines. Each sound made Rachel's chest tighten. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this. A daughter should be by her mother's side during childbirth. A wife should be by her husband's side, welcoming their child. But Rachel was neither. She was something else entirely, caught in a cruel overlap that defied all definition. When the baby's cry finally pierced the air, Rachel's knees buckled. She pressed her hands to her face, unable to contain the wave of grief and rage. Minutes later, a nurse appeared in the hallway, carrying the newborn swaddled in a blanket. Rachel forced herself to look. Tiny fingers, a soft face, innocent eyes. None of this was the child's fault. And yet, every feature was a reminder of the betrayal that had poisoned her family. Rachel's heart wavered. Could she hate a baby for being born into a nightmare not of its own making? Or would she be forced to accept it as a half-sibling, a stepchild, or something far more complicated? One thing was certain. The arrival of this child had sealed her fate. The final decision could no longer be postponed. Rachel stood in the dim hospital corridor long after the baby's cries faded into softer coos. Her mother, exhausted but beaming, cradled the child as if she had just delivered a miracle. Mark hovered at Diane's side, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. The picture was grotesque in its intimacy, a twisted family portrait Rachel never wanted burned into her memory. She could have turned and walked away right then, severing ties in one clean cut. But something held her in place. Perhaps it was the helpless child, innocent in all this ugliness. Perhaps it was the last shred of loyalty to the woman who had once tucked her into bed, told her stories, and called her my little girl. But as Rachel watched, she realized that Diane was no longer just her mother. She had become her rival, and Mark was no longer her husband. He was a stranger who had built a life that excluded her. Her chest ached, but her mind felt clear. To stay would be to live in constant torment, forced to acknowledge a child that blurred the lines between family and betrayal. To leave meant solitude, grief, and rebuilding from ruins. Yet in that moment, Rachel knew there was only one path forward. She stepped into the room, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. "You've made your choice," she said, eyes fixed on Mark. Then she turned to Diane, her voice quieter, almost breaking. "And so have I." Without waiting for a reply, she walked away, past the sterile halls, past the life she once imagined, past the wreckage of trust that could never be restored. Rachel didn't know what waited beyond those doors, but she knew one truth. She would never again be defined by their betrayal. Her story, though scarred, was hers alone now. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up, share this video, and subscribe for more deep dives into true crime cases. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay safe.